The Persian rug my late husband Franklin brought back from his Navy deployment in 1962 now sits beneath my daughter-in-law's crystal chandelier in what used to be my living room. That rug has witnessed 60 years of family dinners, Christmas, mornings, and grandchildren's first steps. Now I sleep on a cot in the garage while Brianna redecorates my home with modern touches that cost more than most people's cars. But she doesn't know what I keep locked in the safety deposit box downtown. The deed that proves this house, every room she's transforming, every wall she's painting, belongs to me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Claire Morrison, and at 78 years old, I never imagined I'd be telling this story. For the past 6 decades, I've lived in the same 2-story colonial house on Maple Street in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Franklin and I bought it in 1964 for $12,000, what seemed like a fortune then for a young couple with big dreams and modest savings. He was a machinist at the John Deere plant, and I taught 3rd grade at Cedar Falls Elementary. We scraped together every penny for that down payment, eating beans and rice for months, walking instead of driving, mending clothes until they fell apart. That house wasn't just our home, it was our sanctuary, our investment, our legacy. Franklin painted every room himself, installed the hardwood floors with his own hands during weekends and evenings. I planted the garden that still blooms every spring, roses by the front porch, tomatoes in the back, apple trees that now tower over the fence line. We raised our son Tobias in that house, watched him take his first steps across the living room floor, taught him to ride his bike in the driveway, celebrated his high school graduation in the backyard. Under string lights we hung ourselves. When Franklin passed away in 2018, after a brief but brutal battle with lung cancer, I thought I might sell the house. The memories felt too heavy some days, the silence too profound. The mortgage had been paid off for 20 years by then, and the property value had increased beyond anything we could have imagined when we were young. Real estate agents called weekly, eager to list what they called prime residential property in a desirable neighborhood. But I couldn't bring myself to leave. This wasn't just real estate, it was the physical manifestation of everything Franklin and I had built together. Tobias, my 45-year-old son, had always been what people generously called a free spirit. After dropping out of 3 different colleges, he drifted through various jobs: pizza delivery, retail clerk, construction helper when he could find the work. He'd never quite found his footing, never developed what Franklin used to call stick-to-it-iveness. At 45, he was still talking about his big break coming any day now, still convinced that success was something that happened to people rather than something they worked toward. When Franklin died, Tobias was living in a studio apartment across town, behind on rent and working part-time at a sporting goods store. The grief hit him hard, harder than I expected, actually. He'd always had a complicated relationship with his father, who'd tried unsuccessfully to instill work ethic and responsibility in a son who seemed allergic to both. But Franklin's death left Tobias rudderless in a way that worried me deeply. So when he asked if he could stay with me temporarily while he figured things out, I said yes. How could I refuse my only child during his time of mourning? But the house felt too big anyway, and I thought the company might help us both heal. What I envisioned was a few months of shared grief, family dinners, maybe some help with the yard work and household maintenance I was struggling to manage alone. What I didn't anticipate was Brianna. Tobias met her 6 months after moving in with me at a coffee shop where she worked as a barista while pursuing her interior design career. Brianna was 32, stunning in an Instagram-perfect way, with perfectly highlighted blonde hair and a wardrobe that seemed expensive for someone serving lattes. She had strong opinions about everything, from the dated decor in my house to the inefficient way I organized my kitchen cabinets. She spoke in a breathy voice about aesthetic vision and spatial optimization, as if she were discussing rocket science rather than throw pillows. 6 months after they started dating, she'd essentially moved into my house too. Not officially, she kept her apartment across town, but her belongings gradually migrated into Tobias's room, then into the bathroom, then into the common areas. Her expensive skincare products crowded my medicine cabinet. Her organic, gluten-free food filled my refrigerator. Her decorative candles appeared on every surface, filling the house with what she called aromatherapy and what I called artificial flower smell. When Tobias proposed to her in my living room on Christmas Eve 2019, using his grandmother's engagement ring, my mother-in-law's ring, which I'd given him hoping it might inspire some sense of family responsibility, I smiled and offered congratulations. Brianna admired the ring for exactly 30 seconds before launching into detailed plans for their wedding, their future, and most significantly, their need for space to grow as a couple. The wedding was small, held in my backyard because Brianna claimed she wanted something intimate and meaningful. I later realized it was because they couldn't afford anything else. I paid for the flowers, the catering, even Brianna's dress alterations when she discovered the sample gown she'd bought online didn't fit properly. They honeymooned in my house, because by then it had become clear that Tobias had no savings, no prospects, and no plan for independent living. "It's just temporary, Mom," he assured me for the 100th time as they settled into what had been the guest bedroom. "We're looking at apartments, but the market is crazy right now. Brianna has some design clients lined up, and I'm waiting to hear back about this management position at the hardware store. Just give us a few more months to get on our feet." Those few months stretched into a year, then 2. Brianna's design. Clients seemed to exist primarily in her imagination, consisting mainly of friends who wanted free advice on paint colors. Tobias's management position never materialized, though he continued working part-time at the sporting goods store with occasional shifts at a local restaurant when money got particularly tight. What did materialize was Brianna's growing sense of ownership over my home. She began rearranging furniture to improve the flow. She criticized my decorating choices as stuck in the past and visually cluttered. She complained about the dated appliances and inefficient layout, suggesting renovations that would really open up the space and maximize the home's potential. At first, I tried to be accommodating. These were my son and daughter-in-law, after all, and they were going through a difficult adjustment period. Young couples needed time to establish themselves. Surely they would find their independence soon, and we'd all look back on this period as a necessary but temporary arrangement that had brought us closer as a family. I was wrong about everything. The conversation that changed everything happened on a rainy Thursday evening in March 2022. I was preparing dinner in my kitchen, Franklin's favorite meatloaf with mashed potatoes, when Brianna and Tobias approached me with what they called an exciting opportunity. They'd been living with me for almost 3 years by then, and I'd grown accustomed to their presence, even if it wasn't the arrangement I'd originally envisioned. "Claire," Brianna said, settling into one of my kitchen chairs with the dramatic flair she brought to everything. "Tobias and I have been talking, and we've come up with a solution that could really benefit all of us." She had that breathless quality in her voice that I'd learned to recognize as her persuasion mode. "You know how we've been struggling to find the right apartment? Well, what if we stayed here permanently, but made some real improvements to the house? Investments that would increase the property value significantly." Tobias nodded eagerly beside her, more animated than I'd seen him in months. "Mom, Brianna has some incredible ideas. She's been researching the real estate market in this neighborhood, and with the right renovations, this house could be worth 3 times what you and Dad paid for it. Maybe more." I set down my wooden spoon and turned to face them fully. "What kind of renovations?" Brianna's eyes lit up. "Oh, Claire, I'm so glad you asked. I've been dying to share my vision with you." She pulled out her phone and began swiping through photos. Open floor plan, obviously. These walls between the kitchen and living room are so dated. They're blocking the natural flow of the space. We'd knock those out, install a gorgeous kitchen island with waterfall countertops, Maybe add some pendant lighting to really make it pop. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She continued scrolling, showing me images of gleaming white kitchens that looked like they belonged in magazines rather than family homes. And the bathroom. Claire, honey, that avocado green is so 1970s. I'm thinking marble tiles, maybe a walk-in shower with glass doors, one of those floating vanities that really opens up the space. These renovations sound expensive, I said carefully, and I'm not sure I need— That's the beautiful part, Brianna interrupted, her voice taking on the tone she used when explaining things to slow children. We would handle everything, the planning, the contractors, the design choices, all of it. You wouldn't have to worry about a single detail, and the investment would more than pay for itself when the property value increases. Tobias leaned forward in his chair. Mom, you've been saying you want to update some things around here. Remember, when the kitchen faucet broke last year? And the guest bathroom toilet has been running for months. This would solve all those problems and so much more. I had been complaining about various household repairs that seemed beyond my ability to handle alone. At 78, climbing ladders and wrestling with plumbing fixtures wasn't as appealing as it once had been. The house did need work. That much was undeniable. The hardwood floors Franklin had installed 40 years ago showed their age. The kitchen appliances were from the 1990s, and the single bathroom upstairs had wallpaper that was probably older than Brianna. I appreciate the offer, I said slowly, but renovations like that would cost tens of thousands of dollars. I'm not sure it makes financial sense for me at this stage of my life. Brianna exchanged a meaningful glance with Tobias before continuing. Well, actually, that's where our proposal gets really interesting. We've been looking into financing options, and there are some incredible programs available for home improvements. We could take care of all the financial arrangements, handle the loan applications, manage the contractors, everything. You'd essentially get a brand new house without any of the stress or expense. Something in her tone made me pause. What kind of financing arrangements? Home equity loans, Tobias explained. Based on the house's current value, we could access enough credit to do everything Brianna has planned, plus have money left over for emergency repairs or whatever else comes up. The monthly payments would be minimal compared to the increased property value. I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. You want to take out a loan against my house? Not against your house, Mom, Tobias said quickly. It would be our loan. Our responsibility. We'd handle all the payments, all the paperwork. You'd just need to sign the initial documents as the property owner, but we'd be the ones liable for the debt. Brianna nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. And Claire, think about it. You'd get to enjoy a beautiful, updated home for whatever time you have left here. And when you're ready to downsize, or if something happens to you, the increased property value would be Tobias's inheritance anyway. We're just maximizing the investment potential while you're still around to enjoy it. The phrase, whatever time you have left, stung more than I cared to admit. I wasn't dead yet, despite what Brianna seemed to think. But there was logic to her argument, even if her delivery lacked tact. The house would eventually go to Tobias. He was my only child, and I'd always planned to leave him everything. If renovations would increase its value and they were willing to handle the financial burden, perhaps it was worth considering. I'd need to think about this, I said finally. It's a big decision. Of course, Brianna agreed, though I could see the impatience flickering behind her smile. But Claire, the contractors I've been talking to have some openings in their schedule next month. If we wait too long, we might not be able to get them until fall. And by then the costs could go up significantly. Over the following week, they presented me with folder after folder of renovation plans, financing options, and contractor estimates. Brianna had clearly been planning this for months, maybe longer. Every detail had been researched, every financial scenario calculated. She showed me before and after photos of similar homes, property value comparisons in our neighborhood, even testimonials from other homeowners who'd undertaken similar projects. "Look at this one," she said, pointing to a photo of a house that looked remarkably similar to mine. Same era, same square footage, same neighborhood quality. They invested $45,000 in renovations 2 years ago, and the property value increased by $90,000. Almost doubled their investment. Tobias had been unusually helpful around the house during this period, fixing the running toilet, replacing burnt-out light bulbs I'd been meaning to address, even attempting to repair the squeaky front porch, step that had annoyed me for years. He seemed more engaged and motivated than I'd seen him since Franklin's funeral. "Mom, this could be a new start for all of us," he said one evening as we sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Brianna's really talented at this stuff, and I think having a project to focus on would be good for our marriage. We'd be contributing something meaningful to the family instead of just taking up space." That comment struck me deeply. Despite my growing frustration with their extended stay, I'd never wanted them to feel like burdens. They were family, and family helped each other during difficult times. If they saw this renovation project as a way to contribute and establish themselves, perhaps I should view it as an investment in their future rather than just improvements to my house. The final piece of persuasion came from an unexpected source. My neighbor Julie Patterson, who lived in the identical colonial house next door. Julie mentioned seeing contractors at several houses in the neighborhood and worried that I might be falling behind in maintaining my property's value. "Claire, I don't want to overstep," she said during one of our regular morning coffee conversations on my front porch. "But I've noticed your house needs some updating. My realtor friend was telling me that outdated homes in this neighborhood are starting to sit on the market longer when they do sell. Not that you're planning to sell, of course, but it's something to think about." When I mentioned Tobias and Brianna's renovation proposal, Julie's eyes widened with approval. "Oh, how wonderful, and how thoughtful of them to handle all the details. For you, renovations can be so stressful, especially at our age. You're lucky to have family willing to take on that kind of responsibility." 2 weeks after their initial proposal, I signed the papers. The first sledgehammer hit my kitchen wall on a Monday morning in May 2022. I'd awakened to the sound of power tools and men's voices, assuming the construction crew would start with something less invasive, maybe replacing fixtures or painting. Instead, I found 3 burly contractors systematically demolishing the wall that had separated my kitchen from the living room for 58 years. "Good morning, Mrs. Morrison," called out the crew foreman, a bearded man named Connor who seemed pleasant enough despite the destruction he was orchestrating. "We're getting an early start on the structural work. Brianna said you were expecting us." I most certainly was not expecting them. Brianna and Tobias had mentioned the renovation would begin soon, but I'd assumed there would be more warning, more discussion about timing and logistics. I was still in my bathrobe, my morning coffee unmade, watching decades of family memories disappear under clouds of drywall dust. "Where are Tobias and Brianna?" I asked, raising my voice over the noise of the demolition. "They stepped out early this morning," Connor replied, pausing his work. "Said they had to meet with the flooring supplier. They'll be back this afternoon to check on our progress." I spent that first day displaced in my own home, moving from room to room trying to escape the noise and dust. The contractors were professional and apologetic about the disruption, but they had their orders from Brianna, who apparently had very specific ideas about how quickly the work should proceed. By evening, the wall that had defined my kitchen for 6 decades was gone, leaving a gaping space filled with exposed wiring and broken plaster. When Tobias and Brianna returned that evening, they were both effusive in their excitement about the progress. "Claire, can you see the difference already?" Brianna asked, gesturing dramatically at the destruction. "Look how much bigger and brighter the space feels. This is going to be absolutely stunning when we're finished." I looked at my ruined kitchen, now open to the living room where Franklin's ashes sat in an urn on the mantelpiece, and felt something close to grief. "It's certainly different," I managed to say. "Different is good," Tobias said, putting his arm around my shoulders. Mom, change is hard, but you're going to love the final result. Trust the process. Trust the process became Brianna's favorite phrase over the following weeks as the renovation expanded beyond anything I'd originally understood. The kitchen demolition was followed by bathroom gutting, flooring removal, and electrical work that required shutting off power to various parts of the house for hours at a time. Every morning brought new surprises, new disruptions, new decisions. That apparently needed to be made immediately. "Claire, we need to pick the cabinet hardware today," Brianna would announce, spreading dozens of samples across my dining room table. "The installer is coming tomorrow, and if we don't decide now, it'll delay the entire timeline." These decisions always came with urgency, always required immediate choices between options I didn't understand or care about. Did I prefer brushed nickel or oil-rubbed bronze? Shaker style or raised panel? Quartz or granite? Each choice seemed monumentally important to Brianna and completely overwhelming to me. "Just pick what you think is best," I'd say, feeling increasingly disconnected from the process. "Oh, but Claire, it's your house," Brianna would reply with that patient tone she used when she thought I was being difficult. "I want you to love everything we're doing." The financial arrangements, which Tobias had assured me they would handle entirely, began requiring my signature on what seemed like a weekly basis. Loan modifications, contractor payments, material delivery authorizations. Each document came with explanations that made my head spin and urgent timelines that prevented careful consideration. "Mom, the bank needs this signed today or they'll freeze the construction loan," Tobias would say, sliding papers across my kitchen table, which was now the only functional surface in the house since the kitchen counters had been removed. "It's just a formality, but we can't afford any delays." I signed because I trusted them, because they assured me it was all part of the process, because refusing would mean stopping the renovation halfway through and living permanently in the construction zone my house had become. Meanwhile, my daily life became increasingly uncomfortable. The kitchen was unusable for cooking, forcing me to survive on sandwiches and microwave meals. The main bathroom was gutted, leaving only a small powder room downstairs that the contractors frequently needed to access for plumbing work. My bedroom, directly above the main construction zone, was filled with dust and noise from 6 in the morning until 5 in the evening. "Claire, why don't you stay in the guest room for a few weeks?" Brianna suggested when I complained about the noise keeping me awake. "It's quieter on that side of the house, and you'll sleep better." The guest room was smaller and faced the neighbor's house rather than my beloved garden, but I moved my belongings there temporarily. Temporarily became indefinitely as the renovation. Timeline stretched from the promised 6 weeks to 3 months, then longer. More concerning than the physical discomfort was the gradual way Brianna began making decisions without consulting me. I'd return from errands to find that the contractors had installed light fixtures I'd never seen, painted walls in colors I hadn't chosen, or removed architectural features I hadn't known were scheduled for elimination. "Oh, the crown molding," Brianna said dismissively when I asked about the ornate woodwork Franklin had installed in the living room. That old-fashioned detail was making the space feel cramped. Clean lines are so much more contemporary. Franklin had spent weeks carefully measuring and installing that crown molding, teaching himself the complex angles and joinery required to make it perfect. I'd watched him work on it during evenings after his shifts at the plant, taking pride in every precisely cut piece. Now it was gone, hauled away with the construction debris without anyone asking my opinion. "I thought we were updating the house, not erasing its character," I said to Tobias later that evening. "Mom, Brianna knows what she's doing," he replied, not looking up from his phone where he was scrolling through sports scores. "These old details look dated to younger buyers. If we want to maximize the property value, we need to modernize everything." Younger buyers. The phrase stuck with me because it implied something no one had explicitly discussed, that this renovation was designed for future sale rather than my continued residence. When I mentioned this to Brianna, she laughed and waved away my concerns. "Claire, we're not planning to sell anytime soon," she said. "But it's smart to make choices that would appeal to a broad range of people. You never know what the future holds, and it's better to have a house that could sell quickly if you ever needed to downsize." Downsize. Another word that seemed to assume my imminent departure from the home I'd lived in for 60 years. I was 78, not 98, and still perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. Yet somehow the conversation had shifted from improving my house to preparing it for my eventual absence. The most unsettling change was how my daily routine was gradually being shaped around Brianna's schedule and preferences. She'd developed relationships with all the contractors and positioned herself as the primary point of contact for everything renovation-related. When I tried to speak directly with Connor or the electrician about concerns, they'd politely defer to Brianna. "We need to run everything through your daughter-in-law," Connor explained when I asked about adjusting the timeline to give me a few days without construction noise. "She's handling all the project coordination, and we don't want to create confusion by taking direction from multiple people." My daughter-in-law, not my son, who was supposedly the co-owner of this project, but Brianna, who had somehow become the decision-maker for renovations to my house. Tobias seemed content to let her handle all the details while he focused on work and his own interests, occasionally making supportive comments about her vision and talent, without engaging with the actual process. By August, 4 months into what was supposed to be a 6-week project, I realized I was essentially a guest in my own home. The contractors consulted Brianna about everything. The mail was redirected to a P.O. box she'd established for renovation-related deliveries. The house key I'd given them for contractor access had somehow become their permanent house key, while I found myself knocking on my own front door when I returned from errands and found it locked. "Oh, Claire, sorry," Brianna would say, hurrying to let me in. "I locked it out of habit. We've been so security-conscious with all the expensive materials and tools around. The materials and tools that seem to accumulate endlessly, turning my home into a construction warehouse." My garage was filled with flooring samples, paint cans, and fixtures waiting to be installed. My basement became storage for the old appliances and furniture that had been removed, but might be repurposed later. Even my backyard was taken over by a dumpster and material deliveries that made it impossible to access my garden. The garden that Franklin and I had planted together, that I'd tended for decades, became inaccessible behind stacks of lumber and construction equipment. When I complained about not being able to water my roses, Brianna offered to handle the garden maintenance as part of her renovation management duties. "Don't worry about it, Claire," she said. "I'll make sure everything stays healthy until we can focus on landscaping improvements." Landscaping improvements. Another addition to a project that seemed to expand daily, adding costs and complexity I hadn't anticipated or approved. By the end of that summer, I barely recognized my own home or my place in it. The conversation that relegated me to sleeping in my own garage happened on a cold October evening, 6 months into what had originally been described as a modest home improvement project. I was sitting in my living room, or what used to be my living room before it became an open-concept space I didn't recognize, when Brianna approached me with what she called a temporary solution to our space management issues. The renovation had expanded far beyond the original kitchen and bathroom updates. Somehow, every room in the house had become part of the project. The hardwood floors were being refinished, which meant furniture had to be moved constantly. The electrical system was being updated, requiring access to walls throughout the house. Even my bedroom had been invaded when they discovered the upstairs bathroom expansion would require moving plumbing lines that ran behind my headboard wall. "Claire, I know this has been disruptive," Brianna said, settling beside me on the one piece of furniture that hadn't been relocated. Franklin's old recliner, now covered in plastic sheeting to protect it from dust. "But we're at a critical phase where we need access to every room for the next few weeks. The flooring crews, the painters, the final electrical work, they all need space to maneuver. I looked around at what had once been my sanctuary. Plastic sheeting covered everything. Construction dust coated every surface despite daily cleaning efforts, and the smell of paint and adhesive had replaced the familiar sense of home. My Persian rug, the one Franklin had brought back from overseas, was rolled up in the garage along with most of my furniture, waiting for the floors to be finished. I understand it's been challenging, I said, trying to keep my voice level. But this is still my home, Brianna. I need at least one room where I can exist without feeling like I'm camping in a construction zone. Brianna nodded sympathetically, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes. That's exactly what I wanted to talk to you about. Tobias and I have been thinking, and we believe we've found the perfect solution. She paused dramatically, as if preparing to reveal something wonderful rather than what I sensed would be another step in my gradual displacement. The garage conversion. I blinked, not understanding. What garage conversion? Oh, Claire, this is so exciting! Her voice took on that breathless enthusiasm she used when selling me on decisions I didn't want to make. We're going to convert the garage into a beautiful temporary living space for you. Think of it as your own private apartment while the main house is being finished. The garage. The place where Franklin had stored his tools, where I kept my gardening supplies, where we'd parked our cars for decades. The concrete-floored, uninsulated space that got hot in summer and freezing in winter. You want me to live in the garage? Not live, temporarily stay, Brianna corrected quickly. And not the garage as it is now. We're talking about a complete transformation. Insulation, flooring, a space heater for winter, even a small refrigerator and microwave setup. It would be like having your own studio apartment, completely private and peaceful while all the construction chaos happens in the main house. Tobias appeared from the kitchen, clearly having been waiting for his cue. Mom, it's actually a great idea. The garage is completely separate from the construction noise. You'd be able to sleep through the night without power tools waking you up at 6 a.m. I stared at my son, wondering when he'd become someone who could suggest his elderly mother sleep in a garage as if it were a reasonable accommodation. Tobias, that's a garage. People park cars in garages. They don't live in them. People convert garages all the time, Brianna interjected. It's a very popular home improvement trend. Mother-in-law suites, guest quarters, home offices. Garages are incredibly versatile spaces. Mother-in-law suites. The phrase stung because it made my displacement sound like a generous gift rather than what it actually was. An eviction from my own home dressed up in renovation vocabulary. How long would this temporary arrangement last? I asked. Brianna and Tobias exchanged a glance that lasted a fraction too long. Well, Brianna said carefully, the main house construction should be finished by Christmas. Maybe New Year's at the latest, so probably 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks of sleeping in my garage while they completed renovations to my house that I'd never fully agreed to and certainly hadn't anticipated would displace me entirely from my living space. And what if I say no? Another exchanged glance, this one more uncomfortable. Tobias cleared his throat. Mom, the reality is that the main house isn't livable right now. The floors are half finished, there's no functioning kitchen, and the electrical work means we're shutting off power to different areas every day. You can't really stay in the house safely during this final phase. Then maybe we should pause the renovation until spring, I suggested. Finish what's essential and leave the rest for when the weather's better and I can temporarily stay elsewhere. Brianna's mask of enthusiasm slipped for just a moment, revealing something harder underneath. Claire, we can't pause now. We have contractors scheduled, materials ordered, loan payments that don't stop just because construction gets delayed. The financial implications of stopping mid-project would be significant. Financial implications for whom? I wondered. They'd assured me they were handling all the costs, But increasingly it seemed like my signatures had been required for more financial commitments than I'd understood. Besides, Brianna continued, her smile returning, I think you'll actually love having your own space. No more tiptoeing around each other, no more worrying about disturbing anyone. Complete independence and privacy. Independence. Privacy. Words that sounded positive, but felt like euphemisms for isolation and abandonment. I need to think about this, I said. Of course, Tobias agreed quickly. But Mom, the crew needs to start on the bedroom floors Monday morning. If we're going to set up the garage space, we really need to do it this weekend. This weekend. Once again, I was being given almost no time to consider a major decision about my living arrangements in my own home. Over the next 2 days, I watched as my garage was hastily converted into what Brianna enthusiastically called my temporary retreat. They installed a space heater, laid down area rugs over the concrete floor, and set up a small table with a microwave, mini refrigerator, and electric kettle. My bed from the guest room was moved out there, along with a small dresser and the one comfortable chair that had survived the renovation so far. See how cozy this is? Brianna said as she arranged throw pillows on my bed and plugged in a table lamp. It's like a little cottage, so much more peaceful than the chaos in the main house. I stood in the doorway of my garage, looking at the pathetic attempt to make a storage space livable, and felt something break inside me. This wasn't temporary accommodation. This was exile. I was being removed from my own home by people who claimed to be improving it for my benefit. But I was tired. Bone deep, overwhelmingly tired from months of construction noise, dust, displaced furniture, and constant decisions about things I didn't care about. The garage, humiliating as it was, offered something I hadn't had in months, quiet, and a door I could close. It's fine, I said, because arguing seemed to require energy I no longer possessed. I'll make it work. That first night, lying on my bed in the garage, I stared at the bare rafters overhead and listened to the silence that felt more like abandonment than peace. The space heater hummed in the corner, the concrete floor radiated cold through the thin rugs, and the smell of motor oil and old paint cans lingered despite Brianna's attempts to mask it with air fresheners. This was how far I'd fallen. A 78-year-old woman sleeping in a garage while strangers renovated the house she'd lived in for 60 years. The house she'd bought with her late husband's hard-earned money. The house that held every memory of their life together. But, as I lay there in the darkness, something else began to surface through my exhaustion and humiliation. Anger. Not the hot, explosive kind, but something colder and more determined. I began to think about how this had happened, how a simple kitchen update had become a complete takeover of my home and my life, and for the first time in months, I began to think about what I might do about it. Living in the garage forced me to see my situation from an entirely different perspective. Literally. From my new vantage point at ground level, I could observe things that had been invisible when I was focused on surviving the daily chaos inside the house. The first thing I noticed was how Brianna and Tobias's routine had changed once they believed. I was safely contained in my concrete exile. From my small window, I could see into the kitchen through the sliding glass doors that led to the backyard. What I observed during those first weeks of November shocked me. Instead of the frantic pace of renovation supervision I'd expected, I watched Brianna spending most of her days arranging and rearranging furniture, hanging artwork, and styling the space as if it were already her permanent home rather than a construction zone. She'd moved my grandmother's china cabinet into the dining room and filled it with dishes I didn't recognize, expensive-looking pieces that certainly weren't mine. The walls displayed new artwork, modern pieces that bore no resemblance to the family photos and landscapes that had hung there for decades. Most telling of all, she'd placed her own decorative objects throughout the space. Crystal vases, designer, candles, coffee table books about interior design that seemed positioned for maximum visual impact. This wasn't renovation supervision. This was nesting. I began keeping a small notebook, documenting what I observed each day. Contractor schedules, delivery times, conversations I could overhear through the thin garage walls when Brianna spoke on the phone. What emerged was a pattern that made my blood run cold. "The timeline is flexible," I heard her tell someone during a lengthy phone conversation on a Tuesday afternoon. "We're not in any rush to complete the interior work. Claire is comfortable in her temporary space, and frankly, it's working better for everyone this way." Temporary space. The phrase that had convinced me to accept the garage arrangement was being discussed as if it were permanent. I pressed my ear closer to the wall, straining to hear more. "Trust me, she's much happier out there," Brianna continued. "No construction noise, complete privacy, her own entrance. It's really the ideal solution for someone her age who needs more. Managed care." Managed care. I wasn't receiving any care, managed or otherwise. I was receiving exile disguised as accommodation. The next revelation came when I began paying attention to the mail. Since I no longer had regular access to the main house during the day, I'd asked Tobias to bring me any mail that arrived for me. What I received was a handful of catalogs and newsletters, but none of the official correspondence I should have been getting. Bank statements, insurance documents, or bills related to the massive loan they'd supposedly taken out for the renovations. When I asked Tobias about this, he assured me that all the important mail was being handled as part of their project management. "Mom, you don't need to worry about any of the renovation paperwork. We're handling all that stuff so you can just relax and enjoy your time off from household management." Time off from household management. As if being displaced from my own home were a vacation rather than a humiliation. It was my neighbor Julie Patterson who inadvertently provided the next piece of the puzzle. She'd taken to visiting me in the garage most afternoons, bringing coffee and expressing concern about my living situation. "Claire, I have to ask," she said during one of these visits, settling into the folding chair that served as my only guest seating. "Are you really okay with this arrangement? Because from the outside, it looks like you're being, well, pushed out of your own home." I'd been thinking the same thing but hadn't wanted to voice it, even to myself. Hearing Julie say it aloud gave me permission to acknowledge what I'd been observing. "I don't think this was ever intended to be temporary," I admitted. Julie nodded grimly. "I was afraid of that. And Claire, there's something else you should know. I've been getting questions." "What kind of questions?" "From neighbors, from people, at the grocery store. Word has gotten around that you're living in your garage while your son and his wife renovate the house. People are concerned. Some are saying it looks like elder abuse." Elder abuse. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. I'd been thinking of my situation as manipulation, as being taken advantage of, but I hadn't considered that it might actually constitute legal abuse. "Who's been asking questions?" "Well, Lindsay Foster from the end of the street mentioned it to me yesterday. She said her daughter-in-law works for social services, and when she heard about your situation, she was pretty upset. Said there are laws about these kinds of living arrangements." That conversation planted a seed that grew over the following days. I began researching elder abuse laws on my phone during the long, lonely hours in the garage. What I discovered was disturbing. Financial exploitation, housing displacement, isolation from support systems. My situation checked multiple boxes for what legal experts considered elder abuse. But I needed more than just legal definitions. I needed to understand the full scope of what was happening to me. And that meant gathering concrete evidence rather than just observations and suspicions. The opportunity came when Brianna and Tobias announced they would be gone for an entire weekend, visiting Brianna's family in Des Moines. They'd left detailed instructions with Connor about continuing the work in their absence, but for the first time in months, I would have unsupervised access to the house. "We'll be back Sunday evening," Tobias told me as they loaded suitcases into their car. "Connor has our numbers if there are any emergencies with the construction." I waited until their car disappeared down Maple Street before making my move. Using my key, the one they didn't know I still had, copied years ago and kept in my gardening shed, I entered my own home like a burglar. What I found inside was worse than I'd imagined. The house had been completely transformed, but not into the updated version of my family home that had been promised. Instead, it had become Brianna's vision of a modern showcase, stripped of every trace of the life Franklin and I had built there. The built-in bookcases where we'd displayed family photos and Franklin's naval mementos had been removed entirely. The wallpaper Franklin had helped me hang in the dining room, a delicate floral pattern we'd chosen together for our 25th anniversary, was gone, replaced by neutral paint that could have belonged to anyone. Even the kitchen window where I'd watched my garden for decades had been enlarged and repositioned, eliminating the perfect view of Franklin's apple trees. But the most devastating discovery was in what used to be my bedroom. Brianna had clearly claimed it as her own, filling the closet with her clothes and covering the dresser with her personal items. My belongings, the few that hadn't been stored or discarded, were nowhere to be seen. In the nightstand drawer, I found a folder labeled Property Management that contained documents I'd never seen before, loan agreements with my forged signature, insurance papers listing Brianna as the primary contact, and most shocking of all, a realtor's market analysis, estimating the house's value after renovations with handwritten notes about optimal timing for listing. They weren't just displacing me from my home, they were planning to sell it. The documents I'd discovered in that nightstand drawer were just the beginning. Over the following weeks, I systematically searched every accessible part of my house during the brief windows when Brianna and Tobias were both gone. What I uncovered was a carefully orchestrated plan that had been in motion far longer than I'd realized. In the home office that had once been Franklin's workshop, I found a filing cabinet that Brianna apparently considered secure from my prying eyes. Inside were months of correspondence with real estate agents, contractors, and financial institutions, all painting a picture of a woman who had been planning this takeover from the moment she married my son. The earliest document was dated just 3 months after their wedding, a consultation request with a financial planner about maximizing inheritance potential through strategic property improvements. The language was cold and calculating, discussing my house as if it were already Brianna's asset rather than my home. But it was the correspondence with a company called Elder Transition Services that made my blood run cold. Their brochures promoted compassionate relocation solutions for aging family members, with testimonials from adult children who had successfully transitioned their elderly parents to more appropriate living situations. The most damning piece of evidence was a detailed timeline in Brianna's handwriting, outlining each phase of what she called Project Independence. Phase 1 had been establishing financial control through the renovation loans. Phase 2 was physical displacement, getting me out of the main house. Phase 3, scheduled for early spring 2023, was assisted living transition, followed by property optimization. Property optimization, the clinical term for selling my home out from under me. I photographed every document with my phone, creating a digital record of the conspiracy that had upended my life. But I needed to understand the full scope of their financial manipulation, which meant tracing the money trail. The bank statements I found painted a disturbing picture. The renovation loans that Tobias had assured me were entirely their responsibility were actually secured against my house. My signature, or what purported to be my signature, appeared on loan documents totaling over $200,000. But according to the contractor invoices I found, the actual renovation costs were less than half that amount. Where had the rest of the money gone? The answer came in the form of credit card statements and purchase receipts hidden in a manila envelope behind the filing cabinet. Luxury purchases, expensive dinners, even a down payment on a new car, all funded by equity borrowed against my home. They hadn't just displaced me from my house. They'd used it as their personal piggy bank. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was a folder labeled Medical Documentation. Inside were printed articles about age-related cognitive decline, symptoms of dementia, and legal procedures for establishing guardianship over elderly adults. There were even notes about my behavior, documenting times when I'd seemed confused or disoriented, incidents I now realized had been carefully manufactured and exaggerated. The notation that made my hands shake was dated just 2 weeks earlier. C, showing increased signs of confusion, refused to participate in renovation decisions, may be ready for competency evaluation soon. Competency evaluation. They were laying the groundwork to have me declared mentally incompetent, just as they'd already stolen my home and isolated me from my support systems. I was studying these documents in the garage one evening when Julie Patterson knocked on my door with news that confirmed my worst fears. "Claire, I've been asking around about your situation," she said, settling into her usual folding chair with a cup of coffee. "I spoke with my friend Margaret, the one whose daughter works for Adult Protective Services. What she told me is very concerning." I set aside the folder of documents I'd been reviewing. "What did she say?" "There have been inquiries," Julie said carefully. "Someone has been calling the County Social Services Department, expressing concerns about an elderly woman living in unsuitable conditions. The caller identified herself as a concerned daughter-in-law who was worried about her husband's mother's deteriorating mental state and unsafe living situation." The room felt like it was spinning. "Brianna has been reporting me to social services?" "It appears so. The caller specifically mentioned that you were living in a garage because you'd become too confused and difficult to live with safely. She expressed concerns about your hygiene, your ability to care for yourself, and your increasingly erratic behavior." None of which was true, but I could see how Brianna's careful documentation of my supposed confusion would support such claims. The garage living situation, which she'd framed as a temporary accommodation, now looked like evidence of neglect and possibly self-neglect. "Margaret's daughter says they'll probably send someone to do a wellness check soon," Julie continued. "Claire, you need to understand what this means. If a social worker visits and finds you living in a garage, even voluntarily, it's going to support every negative claim Brianna has made about your situation." The trap was closing around me. Brianna had systematically isolated me from my home, my finances, and now my reputation in the community. The wellness check would find exactly what she'd reported: an elderly woman living in unsuitable conditions, apparently abandoned by her family in a converted garage. "There's something else," Julie said quietly. "Margaret mentioned that the caller also expressed concerns about your mental competency. She suggested that you might need a court-appointed guardian to help manage your affairs and living situation." Guardian. The final piece of Brianna's plan snapped into place. Once she had me declared incompetent and herself appointed as my guardian, she'd have legal control over my finances, my medical decisions, and my living arrangements. She could sell my house, move me to a facility, and I'd have no legal recourse to stop her. "Julie, I need your help," I said, making a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. "I have evidence that Brianna has been planning this for months, maybe years. Financial fraud, forged documents, manufactured reports about my mental state, all of it designed to steal my house and control my life." I showed her the photographs I'd taken of the documents, watching her expression grow increasingly horrified as she scrolled through the evidence of Brianna's calculated betrayal. "My God, Claire," she whispered after reviewing the timeline document. "This is criminal conspiracy. You need to take this to the police, to a lawyer, to someone who can stop this before it goes any further." "But who's going to believe me?" I asked, voicing the fear that had kept me paralyzed for weeks. "I'm a 78-year-old woman living in a garage, claiming that my own family is trying to steal my house. Brianna has been setting up this narrative for months, the confused elderly woman who can't take care of herself, who makes wild accusations against the people trying to help her." Julie was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents. Finally, she looked up with a determined expression I'd rarely seen from my usually mild-mannered neighbor. "Then we make sure they believe." "You," she said firmly. "We document everything, we gather more evidence, and we find allies who can vouch for your mental competency. Claire, you're one of the most clear-thinking people I know. Anyone who spends 5 minutes with you in a real conversation would see that." She paused, then asked the question I'd been dreading. "But Claire, what about Tobias? Do you think he knows the full extent of what Brianna is doing?" I'd been asking myself the same question for weeks. My son was weak, easily influenced, and prone to taking the path of least resistance. But was he actively complicit in a plan to defraud his own mother? Or was he simply Brianna's unwitting accomplice? Either way, I was running out of time to find out. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Connor, the construction foreman who had been working on my house for months. It was a frigid December morning when he knocked on my garage door, looking troubled and holding a manila envelope. "Mrs. Morrison, I hope you don't mind me bothering you," he said, glancing nervously toward the main house. "But there's something I think you should know about." I invited him in, grateful for any human contact beyond my daily conversations with Julie. Connor had always been respectful during the renovation, treating me with the courtesy that Brianna and even Tobias had gradually abandoned. "I've been in construction for 23 years, he began, settling uncomfortably on my folding chair. "And I've never seen anything like what's been happening with this project. The financial arrangements, the change orders, the way decisions are being made. None of it's normal." He opened the envelope and spread several documents across my small table. "These are copies of invoices and change orders that your daughter-in-law has been submitting for payment. The thing is, Mrs. Morrison, half of this work was never done." I studied the papers, my heart sinking as I recognized Brianna's signature authorizing payments for everything from premium hardwood installation to custom cabinetry upgrade to luxury bathroom fixtures. The amounts were staggering, thousands of dollars for work that either hadn't been completed or had been done with much cheaper materials than what was being billed. "See this charge for granite countertops?" Connor pointed to a line item totaling $8,000. "We installed laminate that cost maybe a tenth of that. And this charge for custom millwork? We used standard trim from Home Depot." The scope of the fraud was breathtaking. Brianna hadn't just been using my house as collateral for personal spending. She'd been systematically inflating renovation costs to extract even more money from the loans secured against my property. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though I was deeply grateful for his honesty. Connor looked uncomfortable. "Because I've got a daughter your age, and if someone was doing this to her—" He trailed off, then continued with visible anger. "Mrs. Morrison, your daughter-in-law has been telling people, contractors, suppliers, even some of the neighbors, that you're senile, that you don't understand what's happening with the renovations because you're not mentally capable anymore." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd suspected as much. Having it confirmed by someone outside the family made the betrayal feel even more real and devastating. "But here's the thing," Connor continued. "I've been working around elderly folks my whole career, and you're sharper than most people have. Your age. There's nothing wrong with your mind, Mrs. Morrison. What's wrong is what's being done to you." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. "I took the liberty of recording some conversations with your daughter-in-law about the project. I hope you don't mind, but I had a feeling this whole situation was going to blow up eventually, and I wanted to protect myself and my crew." My hands shook as I took the recorder. Connor showed me how to operate it, and I listened to snippets of conversations that made my blood boil. Brianna discussing how to handle Claire's objections to work she'd never agreed to. Brianna telling suppliers that I was confused and shouldn't be consulted about any decisions. Most damning of all, Brianna laughing with someone about how Convenient it was that I was tucked away in the garage where I can't interfere with the real improvements. "There's one more thing," Connor said grimly. "Your daughter-in-law has been asking me to document any instances of you seeming confused or disoriented. She wants me to write a letter stating that I've observed concerning changes in your mental state during the renovation." "And will you?" "Hell no," he said emphatically. "Mrs. Morrison, you're one of the most coherent clients I've ever worked with. Any confusion you've shown has been about decisions being made without your input, which is completely reasonable." Connor left me with copies of all the fraudulent invoices and the recording device, promising to document any future attempts by Brianna to manipulate the renovation billing. For the first time in months, I felt like I had an ally who could testify to both my mental competency and Brianna's systematic fraud. But I needed more than Connor's testimony. I needed the one piece of evidence that would prove, beyond any doubt, that this house belonged to me and that I had the legal right to control what happened to it. That night, I made a decision that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. I called my bank and requested copies of all the loan documents that had been signed in my name. What I discovered when those documents arrived 3 days later was worse than I'd imagined. Not only had my signature been forged on multiple loan applications, but Brianna had somehow obtained power of attorney documents that gave her the legal right to make financial decisions on my behalf. The documents claimed I had willingly granted her this authority due to increasing difficulty managing complex financial matters. I had never signed any power of attorney documents. I had never granted Brianna authority over my finances. Yet, here was legal paperwork, notarized and filed with the county, that essentially made her my financial guardian. The trap was more sophisticated than I'd realized. Brianna hadn't just been planning to have me declared incompetent. She'd already legally positioned herself as my guardian through fraudulent documents. She could make financial decisions, sign contracts, even sell my house, all under the pretense that I'd voluntarily given her that authority. I sat in my garage, surrounded by evidence of the most elaborate and cruel betrayal I could have imagined, and realized that I was fighting not just for my house, but for my basic human rights. Brianna had systematically stripped away my autonomy, my dignity, and my legal standing, all while convincing the world that she was taking care of a confused elderly woman. But there was one thing she didn't know, one piece of information that could unravel her entire scheme. Hidden in my bedroom closet, in a lockbox that had belonged to Franklin, was the original deed to the house. Not a copy, not a digitized version that could be altered, but the actual paper document from 1964 that proved Franklin and I had purchased this property with our own money. More importantly, that deed contained specific language that Franklin had insisted upon after consulting with a lawyer friend from his Navy days. In the event of his death, the property would transfer entirely to me, with provisions that prevented anyone, including our children, from making claims against it without my explicit written consent, witnessed by an independent attorney. Franklin had been worried about inheritance disputes, about family members trying to pressure me into financial decisions after his death. His protective language in that deed meant that even if Brianna had somehow obtained power of attorney, she couldn't sell or encumber the property without meeting specific legal requirements that she'd never bothered to research. The house was mine, legally and completely. And soon, Brianna would discover that all her careful planning had been built on a foundation that she didn't control and couldn't manipulate. I just had to survive long enough to reveal that truth. The social services wellness check arrived on a gray January morning, just as Julie had predicted. I watched from my garage window as a serious-looking woman in a navy coat approached the main house, clipboard in hand. Brianna met her at the door with what I recognized as her most concerned, caring expression, the same one she'd used when first proposing the garage arrangement. I had been preparing for this moment for weeks. Julie and I had spent hours planning my response, gathering character witnesses, and organizing my evidence. When the social worker, who introduced herself as Ms. Angela Rodriguez, knocked on my garage door 20 minutes later, I was ready. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm here to conduct a wellness check based on some concerns that have been reported about your living situation," she said professionally. "May I come in?" I welcomed her inside, noting how her eyes swept across my makeshift living space, taking in the space heater, the small refrigerator, the bed positioned next to paint cans and garden tools. I could see her forming impressions, just as Brianna had intended. "I understand you've been living out here for several months while your house is being renovated," Ms. Rodriguez said, settling carefully on the folding chair. "How are you managing with your daily needs?" "I'm managing fine," I replied, then made a decision to be completely direct. "Ms. Rodriguez, I believe my daughter-in-law Brianna has been the one making reports about my mental state and living conditions. Before you form any conclusions about my situation, I'd like you to see some documentation." I handed her the folder I'd prepared, containing Connor's invoices showing the fraudulent billing, photos of the documents I'd found detailing Brianna's plan, and a timeline I'd created showing how I'd been systematically displaced from my own home. Ms. Rodriguez's expression changed as she reviewed the materials. Her professional neutrality gave way to surprise, then concern, and finally anger. "Mrs. Morrison, these documents suggest a pattern of financial exploitation and potentially criminal fraud." "Yes, they do," I agreed. "And I believe the reports you've received about my mental competence are part of an attempt to have me declared incompetent so that my daughter-in-law can gain legal control over my property and finances." We talked for over an hour. Ms. Rodriguez administered several cognitive assessments, asked detailed questions about my daily routines and decision-making abilities, and reviewed the evidence I'd gathered with the thoroughness of someone who clearly knew elder abuse when she saw it. "Mrs. Morrison, I need to be clear with you," she said finally. "Based on my assessment, you show no signs of cognitive impairment or diminished capacity. You're articulate, your reasoning is sound, and your evidence is well organized and credible. What you've described appears to be a systematic pattern of elder abuse." Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by determination. "What happens now?" "I'm going to recommend a full investigation by our Elder Abuse Unit," Ms. Rodriguez said. "We'll need to involve law enforcement given the evidence of financial fraud. In the meantime, I'm going to document that you are not in need of protective services and that your current living situation appears to be the result of manipulation rather than personal choice or necessity." After she left, I called Julie to share the news. Within an hour, she arrived with Lindsay Foster, the neighbor whose daughter-in-law worked for social services, and 2 other women from our street whom I knew casually but had never considered close friends. "Claire, we've been talking," Julie said, "and we want you to know that you have support in this neighborhood. Angela Rodriguez came to speak with several of us as part of her investigation, and we all told her the same thing. You're sharp as a tack, and what's happening to you isn't right." Lindsay nodded emphatically. "My daughter-in-law sees cases like this all the time. She says adult children stealing from elderly parents is more common than people realize. But the financial sophistication of what Brianna has done is unusual. Most people aren't smart enough to forge power of attorney documents." The third woman, Margaret Walsh from 3 houses down, spoke up quietly. "Claire, I've been watching what's been happening here for months, and I should have said something sooner. Seeing you displaced to a garage while that woman acts like she owns your house, it made me sick to my stomach." Their support meant more than I could express, but I knew that community outrage wouldn't be enough to stop Brianna's scheme. I needed legal help, and I needed it immediately. That's when Julie surprised me with another revelation. "Claire, I took the liberty of calling my nephew Jamie Patterson. He's an attorney specializing in elder law, and when I described your situation, he cleared his calendar to drive up from Des Moines tomorrow." Jamie Patterson turned out to be a sharp-eyed man in his 40s with the kind of focused intensity that gave me hope. He spent 3 hours reviewing my evidence, asking detailed questions about the timeline of events, and making notes in a legal pad that seemed to grow thicker by the minute. "Mrs. Morrison, this is one of the most comprehensive cases of elder financial abuse I've encountered," he said finally. "The forged signatures alone are enough for serious criminal charges, but the fraudulent power of attorney documents elevate this to felony territory." "Can we stop her?" I asked. "We can do better than that," Jaime replied with a grim smile. "We can dismantle her entire scheme and potentially send her to prison. But first, we need to secure your property rights and revoke any fraudulent legal documents she's filed." He explained the process, filing emergency motions to freeze any financial accounts tied to the fraudulent loans, petitioning the court to invalidate the power of attorney documents, and working with law enforcement to build a criminal case for financial elder abuse. "The key piece of evidence we need is the original deed to your property," Jaime said. "If it contains the protective language you described, it will trump any other claims Brianna might try to make." That evening, I waited until Brianna and Tobias left for their weekly dinner out, a routine I'd observed from my garage window for months. Using my hidden key, I slipped into the house and retrieved Franklin's lockbox from our bedroom closet. Inside, along with his Navy discharge papers and our marriage certificate, was the deed that would save my home. The document was exactly as I remembered it. Franklin's careful handwriting in the margins noted the specific clauses he'd requested. Property to transfer in entirety to surviving spouse with full ownership rights. No claims against property valid without express written consent of owner, witnessed by independent attorney not representing any family member or interested party. Franklin had protected me, even from beyond the grave. When Jaime reviewed the deed the next morning, his smile was the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen in months. "Mrs. Morrison, this document makes you the uncontested owner of this property. Every loan Brianna has taken against it is illegal. Every financial transaction she's conducted using fraudulent power of attorney is void. And most importantly, she has no legal standing to make any decisions about your property or your care." "What about Tobias?" I asked, the question that had been haunting me. "How much did he know?" Jaime's expression grew serious. "That's something we'll have to determine through the investigation. But Mrs. Morrison, regardless of your son's level of involvement, you're going to need to be prepared for the possibility that he chose to enable this abuse, even if he didn't initiate it." I nodded, my heart breaking and healing simultaneously. The woman who had been displaced to a garage was about to reclaim not just her house, but her dignity, her autonomy, and her life. The reckoning was coming. The confrontation I'd been both dreading and anticipating came on a snowy February morning when Jaime arrived with Detective Sarah Walsh from the Cedar Falls Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. I watched from my garage window as they approached the main house, official documents in hand, and rang the doorbell. Brianna answered in her usual designer outfit, but I could see the immediate shift in her posture when Jaime introduced himself as my attorney, and Detective Walsh showed her badge. Even from my distance, I could read the calculation in Brianna's expression as she weighed her options. 20 minutes later, Jaime knocked on my garage door. "Mrs. Morrison, we need you to come to the house now. Brianna is claiming that you've been mentally incompetent for months and that everything she's done has been with your full knowledge and consent under her power of attorney." I gathered my evidence folder and walked into my own house for the first time in months as the rightful owner, rather than a displaced refugee. The living room had been completely transformed into Brianna's vision of modern elegance, but all I felt was anger at seeing my family's history erased. Brianna sat on my sofa, now reupholstered in stark white leather, with Tobias beside her looking pale and confused. When I entered the room, Brianna's mask of concern slipped back into place. "Oh, Claire. Good," she said in that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. "These people seem to think there's been some sort of misunderstanding about our family arrangements." I've been trying to explain that you've been happy in your garage apartment and that all the financial matters have been handled exactly as you requested. Detective Walsh looked at me directly. Mrs. Morrison, I need to ask you some questions about the power of attorney documents that give Mrs. Brianna Morrison authority over your finances and property decisions. I never signed any power of attorney documents, I said clearly. I never gave Brianna authority over my finances, and I certainly never requested to live in my garage while she redecorated my house. Brianna's laugh was sharp and brittle. Claire, honey, you're confused again. Remember how overwhelmed you were with all the renovation decisions? You asked me to handle everything so you wouldn't have to worry about the details. I'm not confused, Brianna, I replied, keeping my voice steady. I'm also not incompetent, as the social services evaluation confirmed. What I am is the victim of systematic financial fraud and elder abuse. I handed Detective Walsh the original deed to my property. This document proves that I am the sole owner of this house and that any loans taken against it without my witnessed consent are illegal. Jaime stepped forward. Detective, we also have evidence of forged signatures on loan documents, fraudulent billing for renovation work, and recorded conversations where Mrs. Brianna Morrison discusses her plans to have Mrs. Claire Morrison declared incompetent. For the first time since I'd known her, Brianna looked genuinely rattled. Her eyes darted between the detective, Jaime, and the documents spread across what used to be my coffee table. Tobias, she said sharply, turning to my son. Tell them how confused your mother has been. How she asked us to handle everything because she couldn't manage on her own anymore. I looked at my son. This moment the test of everything I'd raised him to be. Tobias sat silent for a long moment, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't read. Finally, he spoke. Mom, he said quietly, not meeting my eyes. I thought, Brianna said you were happy with the arrangement. She said you preferred the privacy of the garage, that the renovation stress was too much for you. Did you know about the forged documents, Tobias? Detective Walsh asked. Did you know your wife was taking out loans against your mother's property without her consent? Another long silence. When Tobias finally looked up, I saw something I'd been hoping to find for months, a glimpse of the son I'd raised. I knew the financial arrangements were complicated, he admitted slowly. But Brianna handled all of that. She said it was the best way to maximize the property value for everyone involved. Did you know your mother never signed power of attorney documents? Jaime pressed. Tobias's face went white. What power of attorney documents? Brianna's composure finally cracked when Detective Walsh produced the fraudulent power of attorney documents. Her perfectly styled facade gave way to something desperate and calculating as she realized her carefully constructed lies were unraveling in real time. Those documents are completely legitimate, she insisted, but her voice had lost its confident edge. Claire was having increasing difficulty managing her affairs. The stress of renovation decisions, keeping track of contractors, handling financial matters, it was all becoming too much for her. Detective Walsh studied the documents carefully. Mrs. Morrison, according to these papers, you granted your daughter-in-law power of attorney in September 2022. Do you recall signing these documents? I absolutely did not sign those papers, I said firmly. I never granted Brianna power of attorney over anything. I never asked her to handle my financial affairs, and I never agreed to live in my garage while she took over my house. Jaime opened his briefcase and removed a folder. Detective, we've had these documents analyzed by a forensic handwriting expert. The signature purporting to be Mrs. Claire Morrison's is a forgery. We can prove it. Brianna's eyes widened. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely panicked. That's impossible. Claire signed those documents herself. Tobias was there. Tell them, Tobias. My son's face had gone completely pale. He looked from Brianna to me to the documents, scattered across the table. I wasn't there when she signed any papers. Brianna, you told me Mom had already taken care of all the legal arrangements before I got home from work. The betrayal in his voice was palpable. After months of enabling his wife's schemes, Tobias was finally seeing the full scope of what she'd done, not just to me, but to him as well. You lied to me, he said quietly, staring at Brianna. You told me Mom was happy with the garage arrangement. You said she preferred the privacy, that she was grateful we were handling everything. She was confused, Tobias. Brianna snapped, her mask completely gone now. She couldn't make rational decisions about her own welfare. Someone had to take charge before she made choices that would hurt everyone. Like choosing to remain in her own home, I asked. Like maintaining control over her own finances? Like not wanting to live in a garage while strangers demolished 60 years of her life? Detective Walsh intervened. Mrs. Brianna Morrison, I need you to understand that you're facing serious criminal charges. Forgery, financial elder abuse, fraud. These are felony offenses that carry significant prison time. Brianna's laugh was bitter and desperate. You can't prove anything. It's my word against a confused elderly woman who's been living in a garage because she can't take care of herself. That's when Connor appeared in the doorway. Actually, ma'am, I think we can prove quite a bit. Detective Walsh had called him as a witness, and Connor carried a box of documents and his digital recorder. I've got recordings of Mrs. Brianna Morrison discussing how to manipulate billing, how to keep Mrs. Claire Morrison from interfering with decisions, and how to document her supposed mental decline for legal purposes. He set the recorder on the table and played the most damning clip. Brianna's voice, clear and calculating, discussing with someone how convenient it was that I was tucked away where she can't cause problems, and how the garage arrangement was temporary until we can get her declared incompetent. The room fell silent except for the damning words playing from the device. Tobias stared at his wife with an expression of horror and disgust that I'd never seen from him before. Brianna, he whispered, what have you done? For a moment, I thought, she might confess, might show some remorse for the elaborate cruelty she'd orchestrated. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and fixed me with a look of pure hatred. I did what needed to be done, she said coldly. You were never going to. Step aside gracefully, Claire. You were going to cling to this house and your independence until you died, leaving Tobias with nothing but a burden to manage. I accelerated the inevitable. The inevitable, I repeated. You mean stealing my home and having me declared incompetent? I mean securing our future, she shot back. Tobias deserved better than waiting for his inheritance while his mother hoarded property she couldn't properly maintain. Detective Walsh stood up. Mrs. Brianna Morrison, you're under arrest for financial elder abuse, forgery, and fraud. The handcuffs clicked around Brianna's wrists. She turned to Tobias with one final manipulation attempt. Don't let them destroy our marriage over this. I did everything for us, for our future together. My son looked at his wife, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time since they'd met. No, Brianna, you did everything for yourself, and you used me to do it. The woman who had systematically stolen my home, my dignity, and nearly my sanity was finally facing consequences. But as I watched her being led away, I felt no triumph. Only sadness for how completely she'd corrupted what should have been a loving family relationship. The real work of rebuilding was just beginning. The aftermath of Brianna's arrest should have been the end of the story, but I underestimated her capacity for manipulation even from behind bars. 3 days after her booking, Jaime received a call from her attorney with an offer that revealed the true depth of her calculating nature. Mrs. Morrison, Jaime said, as we sat in his temporary office at the kitchen table that had become our war room. Brianna's legal team is proposing a plea agreement. They want to discuss terms. I looked across the table at Tobias, who had barely spoken since watching his wife get arrested in our living room. He'd been staying in a hotel since then, unable to bear sleeping in the house where he'd enabled so much betrayal, but unwilling to leave town while everything unraveled. "What kind of terms?" I asked. "Full restitution of stolen funds, guilty plea to reduce charges, and a formal apology. In exchange, she wants the fraud charges dropped down to misdemeanors and a suspended sentence with probation instead of prison." Time. I felt my anger flare. She wants to walk away from stealing my house and displacing me to a garage with probation? "There's more," Jaime continued grimly. "Her attorney claims she has evidence that could implicate Tobias as a willing participant in the fraud. Text messages, recorded conversations, financial documents with his signature. She's threatening to expose him unless we accept the plea deal." Tobias looked up sharply. "What evidence? I never—" He stopped mid-sentence, his face going pale. "Oh God, the renovation loan documents. She had me sign papers saying I agreed with the financial arrangements as Mom's son and heir." "What papers?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Documents stating that I supported the power of attorney arrangement because I believed Mom needed help managing her affairs. Brianna said they were just formalities for the bank, that they needed family confirmation for the loans." Jaime rubbed his temples. "Did you read these documents before signing them?" "Not carefully," Tobias admitted, shame evident in his voice. "Brianna always handled the paperwork. She'd explain what things were for, and I'd sign where she told me to. I trusted her. The manipulation had been even more thorough than I'd realized. Brianna hadn't just forged my signatures. She'd carefully engineered Tobias's involvement to create a paper trail that could implicate him as a co-conspirator if things went wrong. She's essentially holding your son hostage," Jaime explained. "Accept the plea deal and let her avoid serious consequences, or watch her destroy Tobias's life as revenge for exposing her scheme." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at my garden where Franklin's apple trees stood bare against the winter sky. After months of fighting for my dignity and my home, I was being asked to choose between justice and protecting my son from his own weakness. "What would happen to Tobias if she releases this evidence?" I asked. "Best case scenario, he'd face civil, liability for the fraudulent loans. Worst case, he could be charged as an accessory to financial fraud. His involvement was passive, but the documentation could make it look deliberate." I turned back to face my son, this middle-aged man who'd never quite learned to stand on his own. "Tobias, do you understand what happened here? Not just the legal aspects, but what your wife did to me." He nodded, tears in his eyes. "She made me believe you were declining, that you needed protection from your own confusion. I thought I was helping you by letting her handle everything. I was so wrong, Mom. About everything. And now she's using your signatures to blackmail us into letting her escape consequences." "I know." His voice was barely a whisper. "I know what this means. If you accept the plea deal to protect me, she wins. She gets away with stealing your home and dignity, and I never learn to face the consequences of my choices." For the first time since his father's funeral, I saw real strength in my son's eyes. "Don't take the deal, Mom," he said firmly. "I enabled this abuse by being weak and trusting someone I should have questioned. If that means I face legal consequences, then that's what needs to happen. You shouldn't have to sacrifice justice to protect me from my own failures." The moment felt like a turning point not just in our legal battle, but in our relationship. My son was finally ready to be the man his father had tried to raise. "Jamie," I said, my decision crystallizing. "Tell Brianna's attorney that we reject the plea deal. We'll take our chances in court, all of us." "Are you certain? The risk to Tobias is real." I looked at my son, who met my gaze steadily for the first time in months. "Yes, it's time for everyone to face the truth." 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen, my real kitchen, restored to something that honored both its history and my present needs, preparing Sunday dinner for a family that looked very different than it had a year before. The legal proceedings had concluded with Brianna receiving a 3-year prison sentence for elder financial abuse and fraud. The judge had been particularly harsh about the systematic nature of her crimes and the vulnerability of her victim. Tobias had faced charges for his role in the fraud, but his cooperation with prosecutors and genuine remorse had earned him community service and restitution payments rather than jail time. More importantly, he'd used the experience to finally confront his pattern of avoidance and dependence that had made him such an easy target for Brianna's manipulation. "Mom, how can I help?" he asked, entering the kitchen where I was arranging fresh flowers from the garden that had been restored, along with my dignity. He'd moved into a small apartment across town, finally living independently for the first time in his adult life. "You can set the table," I said, noting how much more confident he seemed these days. "Julie and Connor will be here soon." My neighbor had become a true friend through our shared battle, and Connor had become something unexpected. A romantic companion who appreciated both my strength and my vulnerability. At 79, I discovered that life could still hold surprises. "I have something to tell you," Tobias said as he arranged place settings. "I've been accepted into a management training program at the state government. It's real work, Mom. With benefits and advancement opportunities." I smiled, remembering Franklin's hopes for our son to find steady, meaningful employment. "Your father would be proud." "I hope so. I have a lot to make up for." The doorbell rang, and soon my kitchen, filled with the voices of people who had stood by me during the darkest period of my life. Julie brought homemade bread, Connor arrived with wine, and we gathered around the table that had once been covered with fraudulent documents but now held a feast of recovery and renewal. "To Claire," Connor raised his glass, "who taught us all. That dignity isn't something that can be taken away, only temporarily misplaced." As we ate and talked, I reflected on the journey from that cold garage to this warm kitchen filled with genuine relationships. Brianna had tried to steal my home, but in the end, she'd given me something more valuable. The knowledge that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, and that real family isn't defined by blood, but by love, respect, and mutual support. The house that Franklin and I had built together remained mine, but it had become something new. A place where I could age with dignity, surrounded by people who valued my wisdom, rather than seeing my years as weakness. The woman who had once slept in a garage while others controlled her fate, now controlled her own story, and it was still being written. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.